Imagine this: an ordinary day at the zoo, laughter and joyful cries of children all around, and suddenly, everything stops. The crowd freezes in shock, unable to believe their eyes. One of the zoo employees suddenly picks up a little boy and throws him into the enclosure to the tigers. What happens next? We guarantee that this turn of events will shock you to the core. Hi friends, it's very important to us that you're with us right now. Write in the comments what your name is and what city you are watching this video from. We read your every message because you are the heart of our channel. Your views, your likes, and comments help us get better and move forward. We appreciate each and every one of you. After all, it's because of you that we continue to evolve and create videos like this. It was a typical sunny day at the zoo, a serene place where city dwellers could forget the hustle and bustle for a moment and immerse themselves in the world of wildlife. The air was filled with children's laughter and the sound of footsteps mixed with the enthusiastic voices of parents telling their children about the animals. Families strolled along the shady paths, enjoying the views. Young children pulled their parents by the hands, pointing to monkeys jumping from branch to branch or majestic elephants swaying lazily in the sun. There was a lively atmosphere around, imbued with the spirit of adventure and simple family happiness. Here, every corner of the zoo held exciting moments of discovery. Someone saw graceful giraffes for the first time. Someone wondered how fast zebras could run. And someone looked enthusiastically at the colorful parrots. The roar of lions could be heard in the distance, adding to the sense of mysterious danger and real wildness in this civilized corner of nature. Many visitors headed for the tiger enclosure, one of the most popular places in the zoo. There, the huge cats, lazing in the shade, would occasionally raise their heads as if falling asleep, but in fact remained alert and attentive. Fascinated by these strong and graceful creatures, onlookers kept pulling out their phones to capture rare moments of the predator's movements. No one even suspected that in a moment this calm and happy day would turn into a real nightmare, capable of forever changing the usual idea of this place. The main character of this story was a 6-year-old boy named Jaden. He came to the zoo with his mom and little sister, excited about this long-awaited day. Jaden was an inquisitive and energetic child. He was interested in literally everything. His brown eyes excitedly ran around, trying to grasp as many impressions as possible. He loved animals and often asked his mom to read him books about lions, tigers, elephants, and other wildlife. Jaden is a boy with an open and kind heart, ready to share his toys with other children and help his little sister, who is only 3 years old. That day, he dressed up in his favorite bright tiger t-shirt, feeling almost like a real jungle explorer. His mom had promised him that today they could see real tigers, his most favorite animals. It was more than just a trip to the zoo for him. It was a small celebration, the fulfillment of a dream. Jaden got carried away, imagining how great it would be to touch a real tiger, to see one up close. He couldn't imagine that he would soon have a much closer encounter with a tiger than he had ever dreamed. Jaden was overflowing with excitement and confidence that this day would be one of the most memorable of his life, but not in the way he had dreamed. The zoo to which Jaden's family came was one of the oldest and largest in the city. It welcomed hundreds of visitors every day, attracting them with its carefully designed infrastructure and safety, especially important when housing dangerous predators. The enclosures for large animals such as tigers and lions were designed to ensure safety for both visitors and the animals themselves. They were located at a considerable distance from the walkways, and thick glass partitions and high fences created a clear boundary between wildlife and the civilized world. The tiger's enclosure was particularly impressive. A deep moat separated it from the audience, and massive glass made it safe to observe the mighty animals up close. Warning signs were posted at every turn, urging visitors to keep their distance and not attempt to interact with the animals. Zoo staff patrolled the grounds regularly, making sure that no guests were breaking the rules and that everyone felt safe. The feeding time of the raptors was scheduled minute by minute and conducted exclusively by staff with many years of experience. Visitors could observe this process, but always from a distance. Safety was a priority at the zoo, and every employee understood their responsibility, especially those responsible for interacting with dangerous animals. These security measures had been working perfectly for years, and the zoo management prided itself on an impeccable reputation. But on that day, something happened that jeopardized all these established rules and created a situation for which no one was prepared. There was a man among the zoo staff who stood out for his gloominess and aloofness. His name was Victor, and he had been working at the zoo for several years, but even in that time, most of his colleagues had never really gotten to know him. Tall and thin, with a dull stare and a slightly slouching posture, he always kept to the shadows, preferring to avoid unnecessary conversation and attention. Victor seldom smiled and hardly ever maintained friendly conversations with the rest of the staff. He always had a serious, almost impenetrable expression on his face, and the dark circles under his eyes and unkempt uniform added to his gloom. Although his work at the zoo was considered satisfactory, many people noted that Victor sometimes behaved strangely. He could stare at the enclosures for hours, as if immersed in his own thoughts, or suddenly appear and disappear in various places in the park, which confused even his colleagues. That day, Victor seemed even more aloof than usual. He walked slowly around the territory, as if studying something, stopping at each enclosure for a few minutes. His gaze, heavy and attentive, stopped on visitors, lingering on children, which added an inexplicable anxiety to his behavior. Many people thought he was waiting for something. He noticed Jaden at once, noticing the boy by the tiger enclosure. A shadow flickered in his eyes, as if a sudden decision had taken shape. He looked around, making sure none of his colleagues were watching him, and slowly moved closer to the boy, who, engrossed in the tigers, hadn't noticed the strange employee's approach. Victor's behavior was unpredictable, and he was clearly up to something. Jaden stood at the tiger enclosure, mesmerized by the huge predators strolling lazily through their space. He pressed himself against the glass, trying to get a closer look at them, and didn't seem to notice anything around him. His mother and sister were a little behind, engrossed in the photos at the next enclosure, and the boy was left to his own devices for a moment. Victor approached him almost silently. He glanced around the area, making sure none of his colleagues could see him. In one smooth but quick motion, he picked Jaden up as if it were the most mundane of actions. The boy, surprised and even a little frightened, didn't have time to scream. He didn't realize what was happening. The people standing around turned around curiously, but they did not yet realize the gravity of the situation. For the first few seconds, it seemed to everyone that it was just a zoo employee helping a lost child. But Victor suddenly reached over to the enclosure fence and, without hesitation, lifted Jaden over it. The boy, feeling his feet lift off the ground and the air chill his face, began to realize the danger. His eyes widened with fear, and he tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. At that moment, the crowd froze. Some of the visitors, finally realizing what was happening, shouted, but it was too late. As if in a dream, everyone was watching Victor, who, with frightening determination, threw the boy over the fence, right inside the enclosure with the tigers. When Victor lifted Jaden over the fence and literally threw him inside the enclosure, The moment seemed like an eternity. The boy slipped from the staff member's arms, his body seemed to hang in the air for a split second, and then he flew downward, straight to the ground, into the tiger's territory. The crowd around the momentarily frozen visitors were stunned, unable to believe their eyes. Jaden fell to the sandy soil of the enclosure, his scream breaking the deafening silence that had come immediately after the shocking throw. The sound made some in the crowd shudder, and tears welled up in some of the eyes. So unbearable was the horror of what had happened. A few people cried out, realizing the danger the child was in. Others stood as if paralyzed, unable to believe what they had seen. Some grabbed their phones to call for help. Others tried to shout to the zoo guards. Parents and children scrambled to their feet, trying to either run to the scene of the incident or move farther away from the enclosure. The crowd began to stir as a huge wave of fear, panic, and terror swept in all around. The tigers, who had been lying quietly in the shadows, heard the boy's cry and slowly began to raise their heads, their eyes wary of the unexpected visitor. They sensed his scent and the fear that filled the air. The crowd outside the tiger enclosure was instantly gripped by panic. People were scrambling around trying to figure out how to save the boy and what had happened. Loud screams, shrill and chaotic, filled the space around them, awakening both shock and fear in the visitors. A normal day at the zoo turned into a nightmare in a matter of moments. Parents clutched their children tightly to themselves, afraid to even come close to the fence, but unable to look away from what was happening. The faces of those present reflected horror and incomprehension, and some stood in a daze, unable to believe that it was real, that a little boy was in the most dangerous area, where there should be no one but predators. One of the teenagers standing closer to the fence shouted for help, his voice trailing off as he realized the helplessness of what was happening. Other visitors began frantically dialing numbers on their phones, calling security, administration, and even the police. Everyone was trying to do something to influence this nightmarish situation, but no one knew what to do. Jaden's mother, who noticed her son was missing only moments later, rushed desperately toward the enclosure, her face contorted with horror and helplessness. She shouted his name, breaking through the crowd, shoving and stumbling, and finally stopped at the fence. Her eyes met those of her son, a small, trembling, frightened boy who did not yet fully realize how dire his situation was. She reached out to him through the thick glass and the barrier, as if she could reach out her hand and save him from this death trap. The guards, hearing the screams and noise, rushed to the scene, but time dragged on for an agonizingly long time. Panic-stricken people clung to the fence, some crying with helplessness, unable even to turn and leave. There was an almost savage atmosphere of terror that gripped everyone who stood by the enclosure, making them truly worry about the boy. And all the while, the tigers in the enclosure continued to watch Jaden closely. Jaden lay on the cool, sandy ground of the enclosure, shaken and frightened to the core. The moment of the fall was still echoing in his mind, and he seemed to hear his own scream hanging in the air and the countless voices around him that only added to the panic. The boy's heart was pounding frantically, and it seemed to him that the sound would echo off the walls and those huge cats nearby. His mind had no time to comprehend what had happened. Jaden saw the faces of the people frozen in horror behind the glass, heard the screams, and realized that it was somehow connected to him. He tried to turn around to see where his mom was, but then his eyes stopped on the movement ahead. A tiger, huge and menacing, was slowly rising to its feet, staring straight at him. Jaden froze, feeling fear clenching his body with cold fingers. He pressed himself into the ground, trying to become invisible, almost out of breath, as if that would protect him. Scraps of what he had once heard about tigers flashed through his mind. That they were fast, strong, that they hunted silently and ruthlessly. The animals that had suddenly seemed so graceful now seemed to him a formidable threat, and every nerve in his body was screaming at him that this place was deadly. Jaden started to look around, trying to see where he could hide. He spotted a small ledge against the wall, a shadow where he could try to climb. But his feet were glued to the ground and he couldn't move, paralyzed with terror. He saw one of the tigers slowly approaching closer, its muzzle slightly bowed, and in the green eyes of the predator, there was that cold, attentive calmness with which it assessed the situation. Lonely and frightened, Jaden struggled to hold back tears. All his childhood dreams of tigers, which had seemed so magical, had crumbled at that moment. Now he knew that tigers were not cute book characters, but real, powerful, and ruthless predators. Panic boiled in his soul, but he realized that any sudden movement could attract their attention even more. The tigers, resting peacefully in the shady part of the enclosure, did not seem to notice at first that something had changed in their familiar surroundings. But gradually, barely perceptible movement and new odors attracted the attention of these fearsome predators. One of the tigers, an older large male with golden fur that glistened in the sunlight, raised his head slightly, sniffing the air incredulously. His nostrils twitched slightly, picking up something unusual, the scent of a human, but this time much sharper and closer than usual. The male rose slowly to his feet, treading the soft ground almost silently, and moved toward Jaden, not yet aggressive but clearly wary. Its massive body moved with such ease that it seemed to float above the ground, its muscles rolling beneath its pelt with an almost frightening grace. The crowd outside the tiger enclosure was instantly gripped by panic. People were scrambling around trying to figure out how to save the boy and what had happened. Loud screams, shrill and chaotic, filled the space around them, awakening both shock and fear in the visitors. A normal day at the zoo turned into a nightmare in a matter of moments. Parents clutched their children tightly to themselves, afraid to even come close to the fence, but unable to look away from what was happening. The faces of those present reflected horror and incomprehension, and some stood in a daze, unable to believe that it was real, that a little boy was in the most dangerous area, where there should be no one but predators. One of the teenagers standing closer to the fence shouted for help, his voice trailing off as he realized the helplessness of what was happening. Other visitors began frantically dialing numbers on their phones, calling security, administration, and even the police. Everyone was trying to do something to influence this nightmarish situation, but no one knew what to do. Jaden's mother, who noticed her son was missing only moments later, rushed desperately toward the enclosure, her face contorted with horror and helplessness. She shouted his name, breaking through the crowd, shoving and stumbling, and finally stopped at the fence. Her eyes met those of her son, a small, trembling, frightened boy who did not yet fully realize how dire his situation was. She reached out to him through the thick glass and the barrier, as if she could reach out her hand and save him from this death trap. The guards, hearing the screams and noise, rushed to the scene, but time dragged on for an agonizingly long time. Panic-stricken people clung to the fence, some crying with helplessness, unable even to turn and leave. There was an almost savage atmosphere of terror that gripped everyone who stood by the enclosure, making them truly worry about the boy. And all the while, the tigers in the enclosure continued to watch Jaden closely. Jaden lay on the cool, sandy ground of the enclosure, shaken and frightened to the core. The moment of the fall was still echoing in his mind, and he seemed to hear his own scream hanging in the air and the countless voices around him that only added to the panic. The boy's heart was pounding frantically. and it seemed to him that the sound would echo off the walls and those huge cats nearby. His mind had no time to comprehend what had happened. Jaden saw the faces of the people frozen in horror behind the glass, heard the screams, and realized that it was somehow connected to him. He tried to turn around to see where his mom was, but then his eyes stopped on the movement ahead. A tiger, huge and menacing, was slowly rising to its feet, staring straight at him. Jaden froze, feeling fear clenching his body with cold fingers. He pressed himself into the ground, trying to become invisible, almost out of breath, as if that would protect him. Scraps of what he had once heard about tigers flashed through his mind. That they were fast, strong, that they hunted silently and ruthlessly. The animals that had suddenly seemed so graceful now seemed to him a formidable threat, and every nerve in his body was screaming at him that this place was deadly. Jaden started to look around, trying to see where he could hide. He spotted a small ledge against the wall, a shadow where he could try to climb. But his feet were glued to the ground and he couldn't move, paralyzed with terror. He saw one of the tigers slowly approaching closer, its muzzle slightly bowed, and in the green eyes of the predator, there was that cold, attentive calmness with which it assessed the situation. Lonely and frightened, Jaden struggled to hold back tears. All his childhood dreams of tigers, which had seemed so magical, had crumbled at that moment. Now he knew that tigers were not cute book characters, but real, powerful, and ruthless predators. Panic boiled in his soul, but he realized that any sudden movement could attract their attention even more. The tigers, resting peacefully in the shady part of the enclosure, did not seem to notice at first that something had changed in their familiar surroundings. But gradually, barely perceptible movement and new odors attracted the attention of these fearsome predators. One of the tigers, an older large male with golden fur that glistened in the sunlight, raised his head slightly, sniffing the air incredulously. His nostrils twitched slightly, picking up something unusual, the scent of a human, but this time much sharper and closer than usual. The male rose slowly to his feet, treading the soft ground almost silently, and moved toward Jaden, not yet aggressive but clearly wary. Its massive body moved with such ease that it seemed to float above the ground, its muscles rolling beneath its pelt with an almost frightening grace. The crowd behind the glass froze in horror, realizing that the tigers were about to attack. The screams of the children who witnessed this nightmare merged with the voices of the adults, who increasingly succumbed to panic. Some tried to scream, to call for security, but it seemed pointless. No one could get through the thick glass and high fence to help Jaden. The male moved forward again, almost silently, and then Jaden, sensing mortal danger, took a step backward. The movement caught the tiger's attention, and something frightening and hungry flashed in his eyes. He stopped, and for a second everything around him froze. Jaden knew that one more step back, one more movement, and the predators could attack. As if obeying some unknown signal, the tigers froze like springs, ready to spring into action. Jaden knew only one thing. He had to stay away from those huge cats, move toward any available obstacle, anything to protect himself. He inhaled deeply, trying to suppress the sobs that came to his throat and the fear that literally paralyzed his body. His every movement seemed so loud and distinct, as if he was the center of attention not only of the tigers, but of the entire world. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, the boy began to move towards the wall of the enclosure, a low stone ledge that could at least for a moment shelter him from the predators. His back felt like it was stuck to this wall ledge, and he sidled sideways, inch by inch, trying to scramble along it, pressing himself as close as he could. Jaden felt the fingers of his hands grow cold with fear and tension as they slid along the rough surface of the stones. He didn't dare look away from the tigers, trying to keep them in sight, watching their every move, every movement of their bodies ready to leap. His movements caught the male's attention, and the tiger shifted, now with more confidence and interest. Jaden felt his heart rise to his throat, and he found it hard to breathe. He realized that his plan might not work, but he was still trying to save himself, his instincts telling him to keep moving because any stop meant death. The females, following the male's lead, approached slowly but determinedly. Jaden realized that the wall would not protect him if the tigers decided to attack, but he couldn't stop. Every step he took backward, every centimeter he gained, gave him a tiny hope of escape. At a dead end, Jaden found a tiny alcove, a hollow in the wall. He squeezed into it, pressing himself against the cold stones so that they ached against his back. But that pain seemed insignificant compared to the terror he felt in the face of the fearsome predators. Now he was almost out of breath, holding his breath and praying that the tigers would lose interest in him. It seemed to him that if he stayed in that niche, frozen, invisible, the tigers would forget about him. Jaden struggled to hold back tears, realizing that only in complete immobility was his tiny chance. Jaden felt his back against the cold, rough wall of the enclosure. The stone blocks were uneven, and the boy fumbled with his hands for small indentations he could grasp. His fingers, though trembling, were now firmly gripping every ledge they could find. This rough surface seemed to be the only solid support in the nightmare that surrounded him. He tried to press himself against the wall as tightly as he could, hoping that if he became smaller and more immobile, the tigers would decide to leave him alone. He moved carefully along the wall, trying to stay in the shadows, each step minimal, almost imperceptible. Jaden kept close to the stone surface, his back feeling every uneven cold stone, which even hurt, but that pain was nothing compared to the terror of the tiger's proximity. It seemed to him that the shadows against the wall could be his shield, that if he dissolved into that darkness, the predators wouldn't notice him. The tigers continued to watch him closely, their yellow eyes glinting like glowing lights. The male took another step forward, his massive paws covered in soft fur, treading the ground almost silently. For a moment, his huge muzzle froze, and Jaden held his breath and met his gaze. There was something ancient and alien in that gaze, a power that could not be resisted, and a mind that knew no pity. Jaden realized that he needed to find a way to stay as quiet and inconspicuous as possible. He felt tears coming to his eyes, but he tried to keep his emotions at bay. There was only one thought running through his mind. He had to survive, at any cost, at least to hold out until someone came to help. In his heart, he believed that his mother was somewhere near, that she would call for help, and that the zoo rescuers were already running to him to get him out of this nightmare. The huge female tiger suddenly stopped at the wall, a few steps away from the boy. She stared at him intently, interested and attentive, but not overtly threatening. That brief moment seemed like an eternity, and Jaden pressed himself against the wall, trying hard not to make a sound. He saw her ears perk up, her tail twitching quietly, as if waiting for an order to attack. The boy pressed himself further into the wall, as if trying to disappear. Every breath he took was short and shallow, every exhalation almost inaudible. He was like a small animal hiding in a hole, praying not to be discovered. As Jaden tried to hide in the shadows, on the other side of the glass fence, the zoo was in a frantic frenzy. People, finally realizing the horror of the situation, shouted loudly and waved their arms, trying to attract the attention of the guards and zoo staff. Panic and chaos engulfed the crowd. Some were crying, some were dialing emergency numbers, others were rushing to the nearest zoo employees, shouting about the boy trapped in the enclosure with the tigers. One of the guards on duty nearby was the first to notice what was happening and, realizing the seriousness of the situation, grabbed his walkie-talkie. His voice was excited but firm as he reported the incident over the intercom. "Urgent call. A child in the enclosure with the tigers. I repeat, a child has fallen into the tiger enclosure. We need immediate backup." The zoo's security headquarters responded instantly to the alarm. Several zoo staff members who were in the vicinity had already run to the scene, and the head guards began to coordinate actions. The zoo administration, alerted to the emergency, gave the command to start the emergency protocol. A loud siren was activated to distract the tigers, and emergency fencing was put in place to close off access to the sector surrounding the tiger enclosure and prevent more crowding. Meanwhile, the zoo manager, the chief veterinarian, and the head of security were gathered in the zoo's meeting room, urgently discussing possible actions. The main task was to save the boy, but in order to do that, they had to distract and sedate the tigers, which required special drugs and precise timing. The veterinarian held a syringe with tranquilizers designed for large predators, but even he knew that the time of action of the drug could vary, and if the tigers noticed the interference, they could become even more aggressive. "We can try to sedate the male," the vet suggested, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But we'll only have a few minutes for the effects of the drug to kick in. Give the team to set up nets to protect the baby." The head of security, looking at the live feed from the surveillance cameras, saw Jaden pressed against the wall, the tigers getting closer with each passing moment. His heart clenched with terror, but he knew the boy's life depended on his decisions now. "Engage all staff, including those working with the tigers. We need to distract the predators while the vets prepare the tranquilizers. Everyone needs to act with clarity and cohesion." Outside, the crowd tensely awaited action from the zoo. Time seemed endlessly stretched out, every observer holding his breath as the staff hurried toward the enclosure. The atmosphere at the zoo headquarters was tense, like a taut string ready to burst at any moment. At the emergency meeting table were gathered the main specialists, the head of security, the veterinarian, the zoo director, and several experienced trainers who knew the tiger's behavior like no one else. On the screen in front of them, the CCTV images were playing. The tiny figure of Jaden huddled against the stone wall, and the three tigers slowly closing the distance between them and the boy. Time was running out, and everyone knew that delay could cost the child his life. The security chief was the first to start the discussion, outlining the basic plan. "We have two main objectives: distract the tigers and keep Jaden as safe as possible until we can get him out. The tigers are still fairly calm, but if we make one wrong move, they could attack." The zoo director listened to him and added, "Do we know how the tigers will behave if we try to use tranquilizers? It's stressful for the animals after all, and they can react unpredictably to gunshots." The vet nodded, pressing his lips together. "Yes, it's a risk. Ideally, we would only use tranquilizers as a last resort, as they don't work immediately. It takes 3 to 5 minutes before the predator loses strength. In that time, they could get close to the boy, and that's too dangerous. There's another danger. Tranquilizers can provoke a panic reaction in tigers. They start moving erratically, and that increases the risk." One of the trainers, an older man with sharp facial features named Sergey, raised his hand, drawing attention to his idea. "We could try to distract them with a sound signal. We have sirens that make tigers uncomfortable and cause them to retreat to the far corners of the enclosure. They might think there's danger nearby and temporarily back away." The security chief nodded affirmatively, thinking over the suggestion. "That's a good idea. If we use the siren and throw the tigers back for a while, we can try to call the boy closer to the fence and then pull him out with a long hook or net. But we'll have to coordinate everything exactly so the tigers don't get distracted by him again." The zoo director looked at the screen again, where Jaden, very tiny and scared, was trying to remain inconspicuous against the wall. What if the siren doesn't go off? We need to be ready for anything. Sergei, can we rely on your commands to signal the tigers to retreat if necessary? Sergei nodded confidently. I've known these animals for a long time. I know their weaknesses. As soon as the siren goes off, I'll try to use commands to get them to move aside. My job will be to keep their attention on me for as long as possible. Everyone nodded silently, realizing that time was running out and any delay could be fatal. Everyone knew their role. The sirens would distract the tigers, the trainer would keep their attention on him, and the head of security, along with several other staff members, would be ready to use the netting to quickly fence Jaden away from the tigers and pull him to the fence. Before the team dispersed, the zoo director quietly said, "We can do no wrong now. We have to save this boy, no matter what it takes." The staff, having gathered all the necessary tools, moved toward the enclosure where the tigers lurked and Jaden huddled against the wall. They were determined, but each realized that the success of their plan depended on precision and coherence. The veterinarian stood with the syringe ready, and the trainers and guards were stationed beside him, holding the net that would help keep Jaden away from the tigers. The chief of security, holding the control panel in his hands, said discreetly, "On the count of 3, start the siren." He turned to Sergei, who had taken up a position near the fence to draw the tiger's attention to himself when the operation began. Sergei nodded, clenching his fists tensely, ready to make contact with the animals. The warden exhaled and pressed the button. A loud, shrill siren sounded over the enclosure, penetrating every part of it. The sound, specially designed to distract predators, caused the tigers to react immediately. The male was the first to react to the annoying sound. He instantly raised his head, tensed his paws, and, wary, retreated a few steps back. The females followed him, sensing something unfamiliar and disturbing in this unfamiliar noise. All 3 tigers were visibly nervous. Their ears were pressed against their heads and their tails twitched slightly, a sign of extreme anxiety and irritation. Jaden, hearing the siren, pressed his hands to his ears to drown out the deafening roar. The boy felt a slight surge of hope, realizing that help might be at hand. He saw the tigers retreating, and a tiny spark of hope flared in his soul. Sergei, seeing that the siren was having the desired effect, began to give commands, trying to keep the tigers' attention on him. He spoke loudly, clearly, realizing that each command must sound confident, otherwise the tigers might realize that he was not as formidable as he seemed. The older male froze in place, his gaze shifting to Sergei. There was something in the trainer's voice that the tigers could not ignore, and they kept their attention on the man behind the fence. When the tigers retreated a few more steps, the guards and the vet sprang into action. The vet took aim at the male, knowing that if he could put the main tiger to sleep, the other tigers would be less aggressive. The rest of the staff, holding the net, quietly crept up to the fence, ready to throw it towards Jaden at the right moment, creating a barrier between him and the predators. The siren continued to work, forcing the tigers to retreat, but everyone knew that this tactic would only work for a few minutes. To the loud howl of the siren and Sergei's commands, the zoo team began the rescue operation, hoping their every move would be accurate and timely. At the shrill sound of the siren and Sergei's loud commands, the tigers gradually began to retreat, but their behavior remained wary and tense. The male, though he had moved a few steps away, kept his yellow eyes on Jaden, as if trying to realize whether the little man was really a threat or prey. The tiger's ears flattened against his head, his tail twitching nervously from side to side, indicating that the predator was on the edge of patience. The females were also nervous and mimicked the male, following his movements. One of them, a little more aggressive, turned away for a moment to the source of the sound, Sergei, who continued to give loud commands, trying to keep their attention. She released her claws, scratching at the ground as if testing the ground before jumping, her gaze darting between Jaden and the trainer behind the glass. Time seemed to stop. The tigers, though distracted by the sound and the commands, were still at a distance that could be overcome in an instant. They shifted from paw to paw, staring at Sergei and Jaden with a gaze that betrayed an internal struggle between fear and instinct. The siren was making them nervous, but their gaze was still wary, their hidden aggression ready to erupt at any moment. Sergei understood that. He could see the tigers watching his every move, their ears twitching faintly in response to his voice. These powerful predators were not yet completely convinced that the threat to them was real. They were ready to retreat, but any wrong move could bring their attention back to the boy pinned against the wall. Sergei intensified his commands, raising his voice and trying to be as loud and commanding as possible. He knew he needed to break their interest in the boy while his colleagues finalized their preparations. The male, who had retreated a few steps, stopped abruptly, as if sensing something unusual. He crouched slightly on his forelegs, his body tense, ready to leap. He could lunge at any second, and this was the moment that decided everything: fear and the threat of the siren fighting his predatory instincts. One of the females took a small step forward, but Sergei instantly directed all his energy at her, shouting commands loudly enough to make her stop. She froze, her gaze turning back to Sergei, but Jaden remained in her sight. Those few seconds seemed endless, but everyone knew that if they could buy just a little more time, they could get the boy to safety. Jaden pressed himself against the cold stone wall, barely breathing, feeling his heart pounding so loudly that it felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. His small hands clutched the rough surface of the wall, his fingers numb and his legs trembling from the exertion. But some unknown strength was beginning to awaken inside him, an almost childlike courage that told him he had to hold out now, not to panic or let himself become easy prey. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to focus, to overcome the fear that was surging over him, burning his mind. "Mom will definitely come," he told himself. "I know she's already here, very close by. She won't leave me here alone. I just need to hold out. I need to be strong." His memory flashed back to those moments when his mom had told him that he was a brave boy, that he could handle adversity. Those words were his support now, his only anchor in the maelstrom of fear. "I mustn't move," Jaden mentally ordered himself. "They'll notice. I need to be quiet as a mouse and strong as a tiger." These thoughts kept him going, keeping him from giving in to despair. He had to hold back the tears, though their salty drops were already coming to his eyes. But he knew that if he began to cry, if he made a single wrong move, the tigers would immediately notice his weakness. The only thing left for him to do was to pull himself together, to become like a rock, invisible and unyielding. Jaden inhaled deeply, feeling the cold air rush into his lungs, giving him back a tiny sense of control over the situation. "I'll get through this," he repeated to himself. "I'll just wait. I believe someone will save me." Through the fear, something new flared up in his soul, a small fire of determination, stubbornness, and faith in salvation. He opened his eyes again, glanced briefly at the tigers, and met their yellow eyes. But now he did not look away, though he trembled with fear. Behind the fence, outside the ominous enclosure, the long-awaited rescue operation finally began. The staff, equipped with all the necessary equipment, prepared to enter the area occupied by the tigers. They were wearing protective suits and holding sturdy long poles and nets. The main objective was to create a secure barrier between the boy and the tigers that would allow them to pull Jaden out of the danger zone. The first to step into the enclosure was Sergey, an experienced trainer who knew each tiger by name and understood their behavior. His face remained calm, but his eyes were extremely focused. He was instructed to divert the tiger's attention and, as far as possible, lead them to the far end of the enclosure. The guards followed him with nets, ready to instantly fence Jaden off and create a solid barrier between him and the predators. The tigers, noticing the movement in their territory, froze and looked at Sergey and the other officers again. The male straightened up, his massive paws firmly planted on the ground, ready to react to any movement. He leaned forward, his gaze full of wariness and irritation at being disturbed again. Trying to speak clearly and confidently, Sergey spoke the commands loudly, directing them toward the male to divert his attention. He knew he must not show the slightest hint of fear. His voice was firm and commanding, each word clearly calculated, and for a moment the tigers stopped, watching his movements. The male froze, turning his head toward Sergey, and his attention shifted to the man who had risked violating his territory. One of the guards stepped closer to Jaden, holding a large metal net in front of him. He pointed it slowly, without making any sudden movements, toward the boy, creating a barrier between him and the tigers. Jaden, seeing that the rescuers were close by, felt a surge of relief and hope. The guard, smiling encouragingly, gestured for him to remain quiet and still while they continued the operation. From that moment on, everything depended on the precision of their actions. Every step was carefully planned. The staff began to place fencing, widening the space separating the boy from the tigers. One of the workers contacted the veterinarian, informing him that everything was ready for the tranquilizer to be administered if the tigers showed aggression. The siren, which was still working, continued to distract the tigers, but its sound was becoming more and more familiar, and the tigers were beginning to ignore it. Realizing this, Sergey reinforced the commands, stepping forward and drawing the male's attention to himself as the rest of the staff approached Jaden. The boy, feeling a little safer, heard one of the rescuers whisper, "It'll be over soon. We'll get you out." The crowd behind the glass literally held their breath as they watched the rescuers approach the boy, centimeter by centimeter. Time seemed to stand still, and every moment could be the last. People were on edge, many covering their mouths with their hands for fear of making a sound that might upset the delicate balance inside the enclosure. Sergey continued to pronounce the commands loudly, firmly, as if hypnotizing the tigers with his voice. His gaze followed the movements of the male tiger, who was already almost focused on Sergey. However, the tiger still remained tense and cautious, his tail twitching nervously and his muscles remaining in a state of readiness to jump. The guards, meanwhile, moving at arm's length from each other, began to narrow the circle around Jaden. One of them held out his hand, slowly directing the boy to crawl closer to the netting that was already partially separating him from the tigers. Jaden clenched his fists, trying not to look at the tigers, and cautiously crawled closer, feeling with all his body that his salvation was close at hand. But it was at that moment that the female behind the male noticed Jaden's movement. Her head turned toward the boy, her eyes narrowed, and she took a step forward. Her body tensed, and she seemed about to lunge forward. Sergey noticed her intention immediately, and quickly moving closer to the fence, raised his voice, drawing her attention to himself. "Get back! Listen to me! This way! To me!" His voice was firm, as if giving orders, and after hesitating for a moment, the female stopped, shifting her gaze back to him. This crucial moment gave the guards a chance to get even closer to Jaden. One of them slowly lifted a long net and threw it over the boy, completely isolating him from danger. The other two rescuers immediately began to extend the metal barrier, pushing the tigers to another part of the enclosure. The crowd behind the glass, seeing that the boy was protected, watched the rescuers' every move with bated breath. At that moment, the rescuers gently wrapped their arms around Jaden's shoulders and began pulling him toward the fence, holding the barrier that now separated him from the tigers. Clenching his teeth and holding tightly to the guard's arm, Jaden felt like he was finally being pulled out of this nightmare. He still felt his body tremble, but there was a certainty in his heart that he would be saved. The last moments lasted like an eternity. One of the rescuers led the boy to the edge of the enclosure, to a small open hatch through which he was to be transferred to a safe area. Jaden felt strong arms pick him up, and soon he was outside the enclosure, surrounded by the staff, who immediately covered him with a blanket and assured him that he was safe. The crowd exhaled in relief, bursting into applause and shouts of joy, and Jaden felt tears streaming down his face as he shuddered. The rescuers finally gently picked up Jaden and quickly carried him through the hatch leading outside the enclosure. Once the boy was on the safe side, one of the staff members gently lowered him to the ground, covering him with a blanket. Jaden, shaking from overexertion and fear, barely realized that it was over, that he was safe. The crowd behind the glass burst into applause and cheers of relief. People hugged each other, tears of joy glistening in their eyes. Jaden's mother, eyes wide with relief, rushed to her son, holding him tightly to her, unable to hold back her sobs. The boy, hugging his mom tightly, finally allowed himself to cry, letting go of all the accumulated fear. His rescue was a real miracle, and the audience, who were worried about him every second, could not hide their emotions. While Jaden was being comforted in his mother's arms, the zoo guards quickly apprehended Victor, the same employee who had thrown the boy into the enclosure. He stood aside, as if indifferent to what was happening, and made no attempt to escape. The visitors, who realized that it was Victor who had committed this terrible act, watched with horror and indignation as he was led away. Among those gathered, they immediately began to discuss why he had done it, but no one could find an explanation. Victor's motives remained a mystery, shocking and frightening everyone. News of the shocking incident at the zoo spread with incredible speed. People who were on the spot shared details, photos, and videos of Jaden's rescue quickly filled social networks. In comments, users expressed outrage and bewilderment at the employee's behavior, demanding punishment for him and an investigation into the incident. The zoo, previously known as a safe and friendly place for family vacations, has now become the object of intense media and public scrutiny. Questions were heard everywhere. How was such a thing possible? Why did an employee commit such a cruel act? Outrage and anger about what happened united everyone who learned about the event, causing a wave of public pressure on the zoo management. After the incident, the zoo management immediately began a review of all security measures to prevent a similar tragedy from happening again. First of all, they introduced stricter selection and psychological testing for employees, especially those who have access to areas with predators and other dangerous animals. Every candidate will now have to be assessed for emotional stability and reliability. In addition, security cameras throughout the zoo were reinforced, and redundant alarm and instant communication systems with security were introduced for each zone. The zoo also developed special emergency instructions for visitors and updated incident protocols for staff. The management also planned to install additional protective barriers and warning signs near the raptor enclosures to further enhance security. These measures were announced at a press conference, where the zoo assured the public that it would do everything possible to ensure that tragedies like this never happen again. After the rescue, Jaden could not recover from the horror he had experienced for a long time. In the first days after the incident, he hardly spoke at all, often waking up at night, screaming and remembering the eyes of the tigers and the horrible moments when he was in the enclosure, completely alone and defenseless. This experience left a deep imprint on his psyche, turning an ordinary trip to the zoo into a nightmare he could not forget. Jaden's parents, concerned about his condition, contacted a child psychologist specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder. Therapy sessions gradually helped the boy to open up and talk about his fears, the terror he had experienced, and his courage in remaining calm in the face of mortal danger. The psychologist used art therapy techniques and stories of courage to help Jaden gradually overcome his fears. Over time, with the care of his family and the support of specialists, Jaden began to return to normal life. Although his attitude towards zoos had changed and his fear of predators remained with him for a long time, he gradually gained confidence. The incident taught him that he can cope with challenges, even the worst ones, and that his family is always there to support him. The incident with Jaden was a powerful lesson for everyone, zoo staff, visitors, and the general public alike. The zoo conducted a serious investigation, reviewing not only safety measures, but also the entire staff management structure. This case showed how important it is to carefully select employees and maintain strict supervision, especially in places where there are risks to human life and health. For parents and visitors to the zoo, the incident was a reminder that even in familiar places intended for family recreation, one should be careful and cautious. The public realized that safety is not just a set of rules, but an active process that requires awareness on everyone's part. Posters and additional warning signs were installed not only in this zoo, but also in many others, so that such incidents would not happen again. This story changed the lives of Jaden and his family, leaving a mark on their hearts, but it also caused positive change, causing many organizations to rethink their approaches to safety. Now, every zoo in the region has begun to use this situation as a case study to educate their staff and increase vigilance. This tragic incident, though scarred, served as a lesson and a symbol of resilience, reminding us that the safety and care of every visitor must always come first. Friends, what do you think about this story? Leave your opinions in the comments. Have you ever experienced similar situations or perhaps witnessed injustice and racism? We really appreciate each and every one of you, your stories, and your thoughts. You are really important to us, and it is thanks to you that our channel continues to grow. Don't forget to subscribe and put a like to support our labor and keep up to date with new stories. We wish you a wonderful day filled with warmth and kindness.